Yes. Thanks everyone for having me. And actually the trip today was not as far because I'm just transitioning back to living in Vienna. So I just had a very pleasant 4-hour train ride instead of an 11-hour flight, which is way nicer. So thank you for having me. As Vera briefly mentioned, I'd love to make this interactive, so we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards, because this is basically what I like to call the coma slot after dinner. So thanks for giving me that. But you all look pretty awake, so I'm glad that you're here and not have fallen asleep somewhere. So let's hope it stays that way. Leading in today's media landscape is basically feels like this sometimes, right? And when I say leading, I don't just mean leading as a CEO or as an editor-in-chief, because I know some of you are, but some of you might be somewhere in the middle of your organization, might be leading small teams, maybe might just be leading projects and not necessarily teams. But it's all pretty confusing, and there are quite a lot of things to take care of if you're leading in today's media landscape. We're expected to think, even if we are on the editorial side and basically are on the editorial side of our organizations, we are asked to think about business models. We're asked to think about organizational structures. How do we organize our teams? Change management, changing behaviors and culture, changing workflows. There are a lot of questions around talent and HR and employing people that are brought to us. Technology, apps, technological platforms are something you need to understand even if you're on the editorial side. And then obviously there comes everything that has to do with getting your journalism out there, call it marketing or storytelling, social media. We heard some amazing sessions today that conversations today that touched on trust as an issue, something you're asked to consider. And then obviously there is all the multimedia elements of audio, video. How do you tell your stories? How do you actually get your journalism out? Newsletters, the whole product thinking space. That's quite a lot. So how do you actually, as a leader, what does it mean for you as a leader to keep all these things in mind, and how do you actually do that? The most important skill, if you're leading in a media organization today, whether it's as the CEO and big boss or as a team lead, in my opinion, is really navigating uncertainty, because that's what we're all doing. We might have an educated guess on what the next working business model will be. We might be able to, together with our experience, with data, looking at competitors, doing audience analysis, we might be able to deduct what we think the next platform should be that we are going on. But ultimately, every leader in these uncertain times is basically making an educated guess, right? We all don't know where the future is leading us. So this means that the perception of what a leader is has to change in news organizations. And I think it is changing, but it's also a painful change. And we see that in a lot of conflicts that are happening in newsrooms, often between a management that is confused about leading a new generation in newsrooms that demands different things than other generations, right? We often see cultural conflicts emerge between the senior management level and the employees. And we see that this old perception of, you know, the boss is just the person who's the most important person in the room, gets paid most, and just makes all the decisions. That in this changing world and in this world of transformation, that identification, that picture, and that image of a boss is just not cutting it anymore. So being a boss in today's media world means way more about, you know, finding a path and helping your team to find a path, working together with your employees and your organization to figure out how do we get there together, right? Less of hierarchical kind of pacemaking, I'd say. Now, we're not going to do like a scientific talk here, but I wanted to share one concept or one framework with you that I think is pretty informative to think about leadership and transformation. And you might have heard, several of you in the room might have heard about different leadership styles. And all of us come with kind of a natural leadership style that we bring that feels more normal and more authentic to us. But you can also obviously learn other leadership styles, right? And Daniel Goleman is one of the authors that is well known for describing those different leadership styles. And what he says is, well, there are basically 6 principal styles, and they basically start with something that we would call coercive or authoritative leadership. Well, not very surprising, those words kind of already say it. That is this old idea of, I'm the boss and I'm going to tell you what to do. I don't want you to ask questions. I don't want you to question me. I don't want you to feedback me. I want you to do your job 9 to 5, and I'm going to tell you what to do. Now, if you move along this basically line that is drawn up here, there is something that we would call democratic leadership, pace-setting leadership, and coaching leadership at the other end of the spectrum. Now, research is very clear that in these times of transformation, in these newsrooms that we are leading today, that are becoming way more interdisciplinary, right? The teams are becoming more interdisciplinary. The challenges are way more about dealing with uncertainty rather than just, production line challenges where it's about being a bit faster and a bit more efficient, right? There are a lot of questions like figuring things out. And research is very indicative that leadership that is democratic, leadership that is coaching, leadership that is collaborative works better in these situations. Democratic does not mean that there is no boss. It does not mean holacracy. It does not mean we're all sitting in a room together and every decision has to be made unanimous. I would find that very terrifying if that was the case in a media organization. So there are still bosses, right? But the way you integrate your team, the way you collaborate with employees and between teams is just more democratic, is just more coaching style and collaborative style than it used to be in this old perception of I'm the boss and I'm going to tell everyone what to do. Now, what that also means, and it's funny, it came up in many of the conversations I had over lunch or in the morning, there is something that some of us here in the room might feel, and I can speak for myself that I personally very strongly feel it. There is something of a urge for more freedom. I think it's maybe a little bit a sign of the times. I think it's maybe a generational shift. But when I talk to people who leave their roles, who leave their organization, who start their own thing, who run startups, who join a startup, what I often hear is I left because of a lack of freedom. Or I'm starting this thing because I want freedom. Now, we could do a whole hour of philosophy and philosophical analysis of what freedom means and how you would describe and define it, and we're not going to do that. But I just find it striking that this is such a universal, and I saw so many nodding heads now, that this is such a universal kind of momentum and emotion that is pushing us here. Now, what that means, that push for freedom, but also the changes that I talked about before, is that media as a workplace is changing drastically. And I do see that not all media organizations I work with and not all media leaders I work with, I think understand the severity and the power of that change that's happening and how it's going to impact their newsrooms. So I just pulled up some elements that I think are part of that change. One, change and the pressure to change is basically the only constant we are seeing, right? I work with plenty of newsrooms and newsroom leaders, and sometimes, and there is a lot of exhaustion, understandably, if you're in leadership, because you're just being asked to reinvent things all the time, right? So a question that I sometimes get in both when I myself have management roles, but also in kind of coachings or consulting projects is, okay, so if we do that now, that reorganization and kind of that new platform, are we done then? Is that it? Can we stop? And I'm always a bit sad that I then have to say, I can't lie to you, right? You're never going to be able to stop. Transformation, you might be able to reach a plateau where you feel change is incremental and you're not totally constantly pivoting back and forth 180 degrees. Ideally, you reach a stage where you constantly learn to innovate, where you constantly learn to deal with that uncertainty and do little changes. But you can never stop. This industry is not going to change to change. It's not going to stop to change, right? That's just not going to happen. So that does something to newsrooms and organizations, and it means that this ability that I talked about, the most important skill of a newsroom leader, the ability to manage uncertainty and change, is becoming so important for all of us, not just the managers. Interdisciplinary and collaborative work are something that are that's not traditional for the media industry, right? When I think about the first years that I spent in newsrooms, the pinnacle of a journalist's career was having a solo office, being able to shut that door and hoping that no one wants anything from them until they leave in the afternoon. That is really, when I grew up in the traditional newsrooms I grew up in, those were the big bosses who could sit and write in peace and quiet. They did not have to sit down with a product manager or a social media editor or a visual designer or a content creator or a data strategist. They just did their thing pretty uninterrupted. Now, obviously, you cannot build successful digital products if you work like that, right? We all know that. And it's also not that much fun, to be honest, if we're fully honest. But it does something to a workplace. How do you build those interdisciplinary and creative teams? Where are they sitting? How are they structured? How do you measure success in those teams? Who's the boss if there is a team with one product manager, one designer, one editor, one reporter, and one developer? Is it the CTO, the CEO, the CPO, the CIO, the editor-in-chief? It's very confusing again. Sorry, a lot of confusion today. I hope I'm not pulling up more questions that I'm answering here. Well, that's always good. We talked briefly about that impulse for more freedom. Now, for many people, that impulse means quitting their jobs. It's so fascinating that you would think in a time of crisis that less people would quit their jobs, right? That stability becomes more important. Now, surprisingly, if you look at the numbers in the United States, more and more people have quit their jobs in the past year, more than ever before. Some of them went to start their own things. Some of them just wanted to spend more time with their families. Some of them had to quit because their employers just weren't accepting hybrid or remote work, and they just suddenly had to organize childcare at home. So not all of that great resignation is, yay, I'm going to quit and I'm going to do my own thing, right? Some of that is pressure that employers are trying to put on employees. But combined with the second big wave, the so-called creator economy that many of you might have heard about, the fact, and we heard an amazing talk about Twitch today, which is kind of one of the players in that creator economy, where more and more people say, well, maybe I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm just going to try to make a living telling the stories I want to tell. I'm going to have a Substack, I'm going to have a Patreon, I'm going to have a Twitch channel, I'm going to, do a series on YouTube. And maybe that's what I do. Maybe I don't need a media house anymore. Obviously, that's a generational shift as well. Not everything is generational, but I do feel some of these things are, right? I was very happy first to learn that I'm still a millennial. But then I was kind of sad to learn that there is a name for us who are between like 38 and 42, which is geriatric millennial, which I found a bit disappointing, to be honest. But okay, I'm gonna go with that, and I'm just gonna say I'm a millennial. But obviously, Gen Z is an entirely different generation, and many of you are Gen Z and millennials as well. The interesting thing is, all research shows that these generations are demanding something different from employers. They are just fed up with listening to someone who does not understand the internet, earns 5 times as much as they earn, but is still the big boss. They are fed up with the lack of diversity. They are fed up with the toxic culture that still exists in many newsrooms, and they are quitting, or they are not letting organizations hire themselves. This is the big untold secret, and the thing no media manager likes to talk about. Everyone is having trouble hiring. Everyone. No one talks about it. It's the big elephant in the room. People are just demanding respect. They are demanding impact. They are demanding to be heard. They want equity. And they are just not willing to accept that they are not heard, and then they are not going to come to work for you. And last but not least, the thing that we all know, new work, hybrid, remote, how are we figuring that out? Big topic on everyone's agenda. Every newsroom leader I talk to is thinking about that. Why is it so hard if we have all these things and we're like, oh, we can just change it, right? We know what the issues are. Well, it's hard because, and many of you will know that quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. What does that quote mean? The quote by Peter Drucker, one of the big management thinkers. It means you can write the most beautiful strategy papers. You can create wonderful PowerPoint presentations about equity and inclusion and respect. Present them, then put them in a drawer and never act on them. So culture, which is basically the way we actually do things, eats strategy if it stays theoretical for breakfast. So without culture change, there is no real transformation. So I want to end this part, and then we'll switch to the discussion part, with just some questions that I threw up there. Some questions that I think we could discuss, but obviously all other questions together. Questions that when I work with organizations or leaders, ask them to ask themselves or their organizations. Question 1, why should someone want to work for us? Question 2, what are toxic cultural traits we need to get rid of in our organization? 3, are we prioritizing equity? And if not, how might we really truly be prioritizing diversity and equity? Question 4, what is our offer to Gen Z and Millennials? And by that I mean both offer in the journalistic sense, but I also mean offer as an employer. What is our offer to these generations? 5, do we truly prioritize our audience? 6, do we know what we want and how we measure success? How we measure our North Star metric and where we actually want to end up in this transformation process? Do we enforce, reward, and measure culture change? Or are we doing the strategy, the culture eats strategy for breakfast issue, where we say we are transforming, but we truly are not acting on it? How do processes and structures in our organizations need to change? And last but not least, what's our model for hybrid, the flexible, hybrid, modern work we need to adapt these days? With that, thank you very much, and I'm eager to discuss all of these things with you.
Hi. So you spoke about different processes and structures, and Gen Z and millennials. I was wondering if we look at it from a different side. For example, so many people move to different countries. How do you think a workplace, let's say a newsroom, should adapt with more foreign workers in it? So, for example, if you only have a handful of foreign workers in your newsroom, how do you adapt to that?
That's such a good question. So funny, we talked about over lunch, we happened to talk about that with the EGC team, because it's not just newsrooms, right? It's everyone. How do you have a global workforce, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean for hybrid, for remote? I don't think I can answer that question like in general, because it really depends on your organization, right? But I think what we see is, and there are, it's early days in or after the pandemic, but what we see is that the thing that's most difficult is if you are an actually in-person organization and then some teams and people are hybrid/remote. That is difficult, because then the people who are not in person constantly feel like they don't get the full experience. They constantly feel like they are second-class citizens in a way, right? The organization is still kind of geared towards in-person, and then there are those poor few people who have to zoom in when everyone else is sitting in the office and the audio is not great, and they are not included in conversations. We all know how that feels, right? So that's the hardest one. It seems that organizations that decide to go fully remote, or organizations that say, we are an in-person organization, even if we offer some flexible work culture, are doing better than the ones who try to have some people who are fully remote, some people who are fully in person, and kind of a confusing wild mix. So that's what I'd say. I think it's one thing is making little tweaks, like emergency tweaks. If someone says, oh, I need to spend the next 3 months somewhere else, that's always fine. But what I would say is it's important for every organization, whether you're a tiny startup or a large newsroom, to ask the question, let's look 10 years ahead. How do we actually want to work in 10 years? Do we want to be in person, an in-person culture? Do we want to be a remote culture? Do we want to be a global organization? Are we going to employ people from 29 different countries or from one country? I think that's the strategic question.
Thank you for this amazing, interesting presentation. You were talking about toxic cultural traits, and I was just curious to know, how do companies with toxic culture arrive at this place where they realize they're toxic and they want to change?
Oh, I love that question so much. That is a really good question. Thanks for asking it, because sadly, and let's be realistic here, right? I mean, real talk. Sadly, those companies often do not arrive at that place. People just leave. The people who have to undergo that toxic culture and live with that toxic culture at some point just say, fuck that, I'm leaving, I'm not doing that anymore. What rarely happens then is that the leadership, the toxic leadership of that organization takes a step back and sits back and says, oh, let's reflect on that. Well, I think we are a toxic workplace. Sadly, that does most often not happen. I'm usually I'm an optimist. So I'm an optimist in all things. So why am I telling you something that sounds very pessimistic now? I actually think it's more realism. I don't think, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a strategist, whether you work in a newsroom, if someone does not want to see that they are part of a toxic issue, I think as an external player, you cannot really persuade them to see that. I think you have to be realistic about that. What I think you do need to do, if it happens in your own organization, speak up. Speak up and show that there is a growing alliance of people who don't accept toxic, sexist, racist, disrespectful behavior anymore. I think that the thing that makes me optimistic about that change is that there is a generation growing up that is just not having it anymore. And I'm optimistic because I see those people suddenly become the directors of product and the managing editors. And I just fundamentally trust that if we, piece by piece, change who is leading our news organizations, that we are solving that problem piece by piece.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious, how do you measure cultural change?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there are various ways you can do that. The most important one is that you actually say, yes, we want to measure cultural change, which I think in 90% of the organizations I know doesn't happen. So the culture change is being kicked off, and then it's like, oh yeah, it's running. We did the presentation, right? We did the PowerPoint, the all hands meeting. It's good. It's, on the way. And then no one ever talks about it anymore. So I think in 90% of the culture change gone wrong situations, it already goes wrong there. Now, how do you measure? Well, the first thing is culture change, I think, can only be measured if you include everyone in the organization. Culture change means absolutely nothing if just the C-level says, oh, we're doing pretty good. But then you ask everyone else, and everyone else is like, no, it's terrible. It's going in the wrong direction. But what I sometimes see is a lot of shoulder clapping, like we did that amazing diversity initiative. But if you ask employees, it's like, nope, nothing changed. It was just, we now have these nice quotes on the wall, but it still feels terrible. And I still see that happen from time to time. And so I think committing to measuring it, being transparent, including all employees and not just the leadership level, and then finding some way to, obviously it's a difficult topic to just track quantitatively, but I think you can find a combination of quantitative and qualitative measures, and then just committing to checking in on a regular basis in some way of a comparable. Comparable means whether that's employees surveys, all hands meetings, anonymous kind of letter boxes, working groups, and whatever you do, ideally not once, but ideally kind of on a regular basis, twice a year, whatever, to see if you're actually showing progress or if things are declining. Thanks. I think that was in the second row here.
Anita, what do you think about quiet quitting as a strategy?
I think I should have coined that term, and maybe the person who did is now earning millions and writing a book called The Quiet Quitting Revolution or something.
Yeah.
So I always find it interesting when some things that always have happened suddenly get a name, because I think honestly, I mean, let's be honest here. I think everyone has worked in a place where they had, you know, some people who were frustrated with their job and who kind of did their 9 to 5 without that much of, you know, engagement. So I think that always existed, and I think workplaces that are either toxic or, if not toxic, then disengaging and disrespectful and not kind of valuing the full human being and the employee in the way they should value them, of course people are going to quiet quit because they still have to pay their bills. So they are not all going to become part of the Great Resignation and say, okay, going to do like digital nomad work on a nice island. Some of them will be like, okay, well, maybe I do that after I paid off the mortgage and after the kids are you know, done with university. So people just stay in their jobs, and as long as it's tolerable, just do their job. So I don't think it's sometimes, so I'm going to say something controversial here. I think sometimes that quiet quitting movement, that like talk about quiet quitting, is used by, let's say, an older generation of leaders. I don't necessarily mean by age, but I mean by mindset. To basically say, oh, that Great Resignation thing is not our fault. The people are just lazy. Thank you.
Hi. Maybe it's a little bit of a practical question, but if these are the questions that we should ask ourselves in our organizations, do you think that is something that management should do, or is it something that everybody should do? And how do we kind of communicate about the answers to these questions? I feel sometimes, especially with the younger generation, a lot of freelancers, a lot of people, you know, some work at home, sometimes it's from management, it seems that you know these answers, but are they kind of understood by everybody?
Yeah. So thanks for that question. It's a really good one. So I'll say 3 things to that. One, I'll start with the last thing you said. I guarantee you that if you're a manager and you think your organization, everyone in your organizations understands all these big answers about strategy, all these big questions, and knows the answers that you would give, you're wrong. Because I've seen in hundreds of organizations that the leadership team believes that the strategy is crystal clear. And if you ask 100 people, you're going to get 99 different answers of like, oh, I thought this is what we're doing. Oh, I thought that was the rule. So there is like a massive lack of communication happening inside of media companies. I think that contributes to that misunderstanding. Oh, everyone must know what we're doing. Nope. You need to communicate like a broken record until you feel you're totally like, oh my God, I said that 10 times. Why don't they get it? Then it's suddenly gonna land there. Now, the second part of your question, which was really good also, is what do you do if you're not the big boss? If you're not the big boss, some of these things are going to be hard for you to solve, right? The hybrid, flexible, modern work model, probably your boss is not going to let you, if there is like a rule for the whole organization, is not going to let you alone decide. But there are other things that you can do even if you don't have a team yourself, or even if you just lead an intern, right? There are questions about equity and how you're prioritizing it in your work, questions around toxic cultural traits that you identify. Obviously, at some point, you need buy-in from the leadership team, but there are a lot of things that we as leaders and as people in organizations can also address and can also start to tackle. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.